the camera on. Well, last week we looked at one of the more neglected doctrines of the Bible, and that's the doctrine of man. The fancy word for that is anthropology, right? The anthropos, it's talking about man. So when we talk about anthropology, we're talking about the doctrine of man. And this week we're going to look at another neglected doctrine, and that's the doctrine of sin. Martyrology is what the big theological word is for it. It comes from the Greek word hamartia, which means sin. And as we talk about sin, it's vitally important that we understand that sin is real. It's not just some mythological idea. It is real, and almost everyone believes in the reality of sin. But even though almost everyone believes in the reality of sin, almost everyone prefers to call sin something else. They might call it a mistake, an error, bad judgment. I was thinking about already lost his name. He was running for Senate in the state. You can tell I didn't vote for him. Right. And so that big scandal came out here. And he did everything but say he sinned. He called what he did all sorts of things, but he did not call it sin. But the reality is, these things that we want to avoid calling sin, they are sin. But when we say the word sin, that just has an ominous sound, doesn't it? We sinned. We don't like the way that sounds because it has religious overtones. And when we start talking about religion and we start talking about sin, that means there is someone I must be accountable to for my sin. And boy, people just do not want to go there. And this is because by nature, we're self-defensive. By nature. I mean, think about the last time someone seemingly accused you of something. You just thought they did. Maybe they didn't, but you thought they accused you of something. What did you do? You immediately, drawbridge comes up, cannons come to the wall, and you're going self-defense mode. That's what we do. We automatically go into self-defense mode. That's our nature. And when we're confronted with sin, when sin accuses us of our wrong, we go into self-defense mode. This is how we are wired. We do not want to deal with the feelings of guilt, shame, and hurt. We do not want to admit that we were wrong. In fact, we are so intimate in this whole idea of sin is that we are all experts on sin. Did you know that? We're all experts on sin. And furthermore, we're equally experts at avoiding it. That is, avoiding accountability for it. We don't want, that wasn't sin. That was a mistake. You know, I just wasn't thinking when that happened. No, that's sin. That's sin. So in our study of sin, we're going to ask and answer 4 questions here. So here's the 4 questions. You already have them there in the notes in your bulletin. What is sin? That's our first question. The second question is, where does it come from? The third question is, how far does it go? And the intent behind this question is, what has it affected? What has it affected? And then the fourth question is, what are the effects of sin? Okay, so that's our 4 questions here this morning. So let's start with the first question. What is sin? And I started to make a list of different ways that the Bible describe sin, the different terms that the Bible describes sin, and I stopped at 11. Okay? I stopped at 11. There are more, there's more than that, but I just stopped there at 11, and I just want us to think about these 11 descriptions of sin that the Bible uses. Number one, missing the mark. The idea is that you miss doing what is right. What is right is the target. You're aiming at the target. This is what is right, and you miss. You miss. You do the wrong thing. Another description of sin in the Bible is breaking something or ruining something. And the idea is you break what is right or you ruin what is good, even the idea of destroying what is good. Then there's the idea of rebellion. And this is the idea that sin willfully opposes what is right and good and the originator of right and good. That's what rebellion is. When you rebel against something, it's not just that you're not accepting it, you're going against it. You're going against it. Number 4 on our list is guilt. And while often we think of guilt as the result of sin, in the Old Testament especially, when it uses the term guilt, or sometimes it's translated as iniquity, it's looking at where does that come from. It's looking at the source of that guilt. So it's looking at the sin. Number 5 and 6 on our list here, we have the description of sin as going astray and then wandering away on purpose. This idea of going astray is when you're going down a road and you go off track. You're responsible to stay in the road, but you go off track. So it's just like if you would go out here, you get out on the highway, and as soon as you turn out on the highway, you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to stay between the yellow line in the middle and the white line on the right-hand side. That's your responsibility. And if you drive outside of the yellow and white lines, you're going astray. This is the picture that we get in the Bible. But there's also this description of wandering away on purpose. So it is as if you know you're to be on the road, but you're allowing yourself just to wander. You're not just taking a different track. You're just allowing yourself to wander. Have you ever seen somebody drive down the road allowing themselves to wander? And you're thankful you're not in that car. And they're just kind of, you see them going down the road. When I see someone do that, my first thought is they're on their phone. They're on their phone. But they just wander, and you can see them getting out of their lane. This is the idea of wandering away. Then we have 3 more descriptions here, 7, 8, and 9. Godlessness, unrighteousness, and lawlessness. So each of these is talking about a person who acts as if these things don't exist. A godless act is acting as if there's no God to whom you're accountable for. You are acting godlessly. To act unrighteously is to act in a way that there's no standard by which you will be judged. And to act lawlessly is the idea that you just ignore the written code. You're a law unto yourself. So the 10th and 11th descriptions here are transgression and ignorance. Sin is a transgression. It's a specific violation of a revealed command. And even ignorance is a command. Do you realize that once God has revealed His will, and He has said, this is what you are to do, and this is what you're not to do, even if you do not know it, if you violate it, it's still sin? Do you know that? When God says, this is my rule for humanity, even if you don't know it's the rule, if you violate it, you have sinned. So there is a sin and ignorance. So these are just 11 descriptions that we find that the Bible uses of sin. And from all these words, we can develop a definition. So here's the definition of sin. I don't suggest that this is a perfect definition for sin. I'm sure it can be improved in some way. But here's the definition. You have most of it there in your notes. Sin is a violation of the righteous God's commands or character in action, thought, or feeling. So let me explain this a little bit. So sin is a violation of the righteous God's commands or character in action, thought, or feeling. A violation is just that. A violation is doing the wrong thing or not doing the right thing. I can distinctly remember in the Marine Corps where I did a lot of security duty in the Marine Corps. And when you take over a post, when you take over your responsibility, your area of responsibility, you are responsible for everything that happens or fails to happen within that post. So if something's supposed to happen and it doesn't happen, who's responsible? The guy on duty. If something fails to happen that should have happened, who's responsible? The guy on duty. It's the same idea here with violation. It's a violation. And what is sin a violation of? Well, a sin is a violation of a righteous God. And sometimes we don't think about this, but the word righteous or righteousness, the base idea behind that word is a standard. This is the standard. And a righteous God is the God who makes the standard. It's the standard-making God. Who sets the rules? Who tells us what is right and wrong? It is God who is the one who determines that. And so when we talk about the righteous God, that's what we're talking about. This is the God who has made the standards by which we are to live. And so sin is a violation of the righteous God's commands. These are the explicit statements in Scripture about what we are to do and what we're not to do according to the righteousness of God. Explicit statements. This is the revealed word of God. That's His commands. But sin is also a violation of God's character. The things that describe who God is, His nature and attributes. Because we have to remember that when we sin, we're not just sinning by doing something wrong, we're also sinning against someone. We're sinning against God. And so when we act unholy, we are acting against the person of God. When we act unjustly, we are acting against the person of God. We are violating God's character. And we can do this in action, thought, and even feeling. You see, sin is what we do. Sin can be the things that we think and even how we feel. Remember that verse in the Bible? It says, "Be angry and sin not." Anger is a feeling, an emotion. So you can be angry and sin not, but you can also be angry and sin, because the warning is, don't be angry and sin. Feelings can lead to sin. By the way, all three of these things, our actions, our thoughts, and our feelings, are interconnected. So anytime we look at sin, I guarantee you we can probably pick out all three violations in this list here: action, thought, and feeling. All three will show up when it comes to sin, because we don't act first. We don't commit the act of sin first. It's first conceived in our minds and even in our feelings ever before we act upon it. And so we know what sin is. Sin is a violation of the righteous God's commands or character in action, thought, or feeling. Now, knowing what it is, we can ask the question, second question on our list: where does it come from? Where does sin come from? sin is a foreign intruder into the world of humanity. Do you realize that? Sin is a foreign intruder into the world of humanity. Now, what does this mean? It simply means that sin was not part of man's original creation. It's foreign to God's design and plan for man. And so I want us to understand that sin was not part of creation. And this is where we come to Genesis chapter 1. So if you'll look at Genesis chapter 1 real quick, I'm going to be going through these verses pretty quickly here. Genesis chapter 1, 7 times in the first chapter of Genesis, we have the use of the word good as it talks about creation. So verse 4, Genesis 1:4. God saw the light, that it was, you fill in the blank, that it was good. Genesis 1:10, and God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called sea. And God saw that it was good. Verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass, the herb yields seed according to its kind, the tree yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw it was good. Verse 18, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from darkness, God saw that it was good. Then in verse 21 and 25, we have the same thing, but put your eyes down to verse 31. This is what I want us to especially note, because this is the summary statement of creation. This is summarizing everything that has happened up to this point. Verse 31. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was, and what's it say? Very, very good. It was good. I want us to see at the creation, things were good, not bad. Things were good, not evil. There was no sin in the creation at the time of creation. And so there's an absence of sin and evil when God created the earth and the heavens and man. Man was created innocent. That doesn't mean he was perfect. It just means he did not have a sin nature. He had not yet sinned. He was innocent. He wasn't guilty of any violation of God's commands or God himself. So sin was not part of creation. And secondly, I want us to notice that God did not and does not cause sin. Now, this is James chapter 1. So I told you to mark that earlier. So turn to James chapter 1, and we would come back to James chapter 1 here shortly. But right now, I want you to look at verse 13. Verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. So when you're tempted, don't say, I'm tempted by God. Why? James gives us an explanation. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. So God's not tempted to sin, nor does he tempt anyone with sin. This verse here is addressing God's relationship to sin and his relationship to others sinning. Sin is not something that God desires or can desire, nor is it something that he wants for others or leads them to. God did not cause sin and does not cause sin. Because in Romans 3:23, we see that sin is contrary to the person of God. You might have that verse recognized. I'm not going to turn there. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So in this verse, we see that sin is equated to falling short of the glory of God. The glory of God is another way to express who God is. It's like a combination of his character and his commands all rolled up into one. And so sin is falling short of the glory of God. If God fell short of his own glory, he could not still be God. Do you understand that? For God to lose even a minute molecule of his glory would mean that he would cease to be God. God, by definition, cannot sin or be in any way tempted by sin. Sin is diametrically opposed to God. By definition, being God involves the total absence, the absolute absence from sin. If someone has sinned, it shows that they're not God. You just kind of look around, say, wonder if anybody's God. Well, you just look, did they sin? They're not God. You have to be perfect to be God. You have to be totally free from sin to be God. And I want us to see from this that we cannot charge God with the creation of sin. We cannot charge God with committing sins or leading people to sin. At most, when we talk about God's relationship to sin, we can say that he allows it. But in his allowance of sin, in no way does that determine that a man will sin. So God is not the one who causes sin. When he created the world, he did not create sin along with it. The creation was created good. And we have seen that God doesn't cause people to sin. And so where does sin come from? If it's not just created in the creation, if it doesn't come from God, where does it come from? Sin is introduced into humanity when Adam directly disobeyed the only prohibition that God gave him. Let's turn back to Genesis. I told you we were going to be in several passages there in Genesis, so hopefully you get your finger there. Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Here's the prohibition. So kind of picture this. God creates the heavens and the earth. He creates man, and he gives man one thing that you're not to do. He said, don't do this. He has given him positive commands. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. But here's the one thing he says don't do. This was the one prohibition that he gives, these two verses. Verse 16. And the Lord God commanded Adam, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. You'll eat of every tree, but, or except, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. So there's a prohibition. You shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. So one prohibition, don't eat from this one tree. But then we turn over in our Bibles to chapter 3, verse 6, and we see the violation of the one prohibition. We see the sin. Chapter 3, verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eye. So it's going to make me happy. It's going to gratify my stomach. Pleasant to the eyes. It's going to gratify my visual need. And the tree is desirable to make one wise. It's going to gratify my intellectual needs, the needs of my mind. She took of its fruit and ate. And that's all preface, because here's the kicker. She also gave to her husband with her, and listen, and he ate. As we read those verses, we might ask, why is the sin of Eve not counted against man? After all, she sinned first, didn't she? Didn't she eat before Adam? Why isn't her sin counted against mankind, humanity? The answer is simple. While certainly Eve was under the obligation to obey the prohibition, it was Adam to whom the Lord gave the prohibition. He gave it to Adam. It was Adam who was the head of his wife and the human race, and therefore it is the sin of Adam which causes sin to enter into humanity. This is where sin comes from. Right here, Genesis chapter 3. This is where sin enters humanity. And what the Old Testament sort of implies here, the New Testament makes explicit. We're not going to turn there, but listen to Romans 5:12. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world. One man, that's talking about Adam. Just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death spread to all men because all sinned. That's pretty simple. That's pretty simple, and it's pretty clear. Sin comes into the world through Adam. Now, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Because it tells us that sin had to be introduced into humanity. It wasn't something that God created. God did not design man to sin. It's a foreign intruder into humanity. Furthermore, the Bible tells us not only where sin comes from in the beginning, where sin first comes from, but it also tells us where sin comes from now. Turn to James, back to James chapter 1. Seems like we're flipping from the front of our Bibles to the back of our Bibles. It seems that way because that's what it is. We are going from Genesis all the way to the back of our Bible. James chapter 1. Now, we looked at verse 13 earlier to see that God isn't tempted by sin, isn't tempted by evil, and he doesn't tempt anybody with evil or with sin. But now I want us to look at verses 14 and 15. But each one is tempted. So, okay, now we're going to talk about sin. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. This is where sin comes from. It gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. In other words, where does sin come from? It comes from right here. This is where sin comes from. Sin comes from the fact that you have uncontrolled desires. Sin comes from the desire to sin. You sin because you want to. You sin because you want to. You have it in your heart to sin when you don't control your desires, when your desires aren't the desires of God. It leads us towards sin. That's where it wants to take us. And once you introduce sin, it will certainly go all the way to death. That's exactly what it says here. Sin goes to death. And so we know where sin comes from. We know where it came from originally, how it was introduced into humanity, and we know where it comes from now, even within us. We know where sin comes from. And so now let's ask the question number 3, how far does it go? How far does it go? Sin is invasive and pervasive. Okay? Sin is invasive and it is pervasive. It gets into everything and it goes everywhere. That's what sin is. It gets into everything and it goes everywhere. And I was hoping that Aaliyah would be here this morning, because she was going to be my visual aid. And you know who I'm talking about, right? Holly's little granddaughter, who is all over the place, getting into everything. That's sin. That's sin. That's what sin does. Theologically speaking, we call this the total depravity of man. And when we talk about the total depravity of man, we really mean just two things. Number one, we mean that the totality of mankind has been affected by sin. All are sinners. All have sinned. Everyone who has existed from Adam until now has been affected by sin. Secondly, we mean that every aspect of man has been affected by sin. His body, his mind, his emotions, his will, and his spirit. Every aspect. So every man and every aspect of man. So when we talk about the total depravity of man, we simply mean that sin has affected every man who has ever existed and every part of man. Every part. There's no part of man that has been exempted from the effects of sin. So how far does sin go into mankind? It goes all the way to every single person. How far does it go into the man as an individual? It is all-encompassing. And so we have total depravity, but it's not just man that sin affects. It also affects the creation. Don't turn there. But in Romans chapter 8, verses 19 through 22, we get a little insight into how sin has affected the creation. This is what it says, Romans 8, verse 19. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. So the creation is waiting for something. Verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility. Subjected to. Now, when did that happen? Genesis chapter 3 is the answer. Subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Verse 21, because the creation itself will be delivered, will also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption. The creation is going to be delivered from the bondage of corruption. So this is talking about redemption. And the redemption of creation is connected with the redemption of man. And so the reason that the creation needs to be redeemed is because sin has corrupted it. And so sin hasn't just affected man. It's affected all of creation. All of creation. Sin goes everywhere. Nothing is exempt. From heaven to earth to animals to plants. It goes everywhere. Sin penetrates everything. No part of man is exempt from the effects of sin. And so we know what sin is. We know where it comes from. We know how far it goes. It goes everywhere into everything. And so we ask our fourth question, what are the effects of sin? Two-part answer. The immediate results. Death, guilt, shame, hurt. We can probably add some more. Let me talk about death first. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. I told you we were going back and forth. So I did warn you. Genesis chapter 2 and 3. We have already had one prohibition that God gave to Adam. Remember that prohibition? He tells him, eat of any tree, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. That's what he says. That's a prohibition. Don't eat from this one tree. You can eat of every tree, but this one tree, the knowledge of good and evil, you cannot eat. And notice attached to this prohibition is a consequence for the violation. You shall surely die. In the Hebrew, this makes it a certain guarantee. It says, dying, you will die. Dying, you will die. That's just like, you are going to die. There is no doubt about it. You are going to die if you eat the fruit of this tree. And so we have death introduced right here at this point. What exactly does this death entail? What does dying entail? First, and most importantly, it involves a separation from God. We kind of get the sense of this when we read in chapter 3, after Adam and his wife Eve have sinned. We get this sense that there is a breach in the relationship between Adam, Eve, and God. There's now a separation, and this separation becomes even more distinct when At the end of chapter 3, they are kicked out of the garden. God doesn't allow them there anymore. So this first aspect of death, this separation from God, is what we call spiritual death. Spiritual death. It's a spiritual thing. It's not a physical thing. It's a spiritual thing, and it's a separation from God. The second aspect of this death is physical death. And we only have to look to chapter 5 of the book of Genesis. Just you go through chapter 4 and you end up right in chapter 5, and you don't have to look very far. Verse 5. So all the days of Adam lived were 930 years. And what does it say at the end? And he died. Chapter 5 of the book of Genesis, 8 times it says, and he died. The point that's being made is as we look at the genealogy of Adam. By the way, everybody here is related to Adam. The point of that genealogy is to show everybody related to Adam dies. And he died, and he died, and he died. Death, both spiritually and physically, is the result of sin. But not only is sin or death an immediate result of sin. By the way, I mentioned that Hebrew phrase, dying, he died, dies. That explains why Adam and Eve didn't die right then. Why didn't Adam and Eve die physically right then? Well, the Hebrew phrase, I think, gives us an explanation. Dying, you're going to die. As soon as you break the rule, as soon as you eat of the fruit, immediately you start to die. You start to die, and you will die. It will be completed. You will die physically. So death is an immediate result of sin. Guilt is another result. If you look at chapter 3, verse 7, it says this. Then the eyes of both of them, Adam and Eve, were opened, and they knew that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. So they had knowledge. This shows they had knowledge. They knew they were naked. They had knowledge of the violation that they have committed. This is guilt. Guilt is knowledge of the violation. As soon as they committed sin, they understood what they had done. This is still the same today. If you're struggling with sin, you know, as soon as you commit that sin, you know what you've done. As soon as you're overcome or give in to sin, you immediately know. You know this is guilt. But not only is there guilt, there's also shame, verse 8 and 10. And they heard the sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, Adam and his wife. Now, what did they do? Hid themselves from the presence of God among the trees of the garden. Verse 10. So he said, this is Adam said to God, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. So there's shame. There's this feeling of, I know I did wrong. Guilt, the knowledge of the violation. Shame is the feeling that follows. When sin is committed, there's this feeling of failure, a feeling of shame. You know what you've done, and you don't want anybody else to know what you've done. That's what shame is. And followed on that, closely on the heels of that, is hurt, the effect of sin on others. In the case of Adam and Eve, the effect is on the creation. We see there's the snake that's cursed. We see that the ground is cursed, all because of Adam. We see that there's an effect on others. Adam's sin affected his wife. It affected his wife, and it affected his entire family tree down to the baby that was born just a minute ago. Adam's sin affects others. And it even affects ourselves. We hurt ourselves when we sin. Adam hurt himself. Instead of taking pleasure in tilling the ground, he has to work hard now to produce enough to eat, to live. You know, if we are honest in our own self-evaluation, we know that all these things are true. We know if a man cheats on his wife, he doesn't need to be a Christian to know that he's sinning. If he thought what he was doing was okay, he would do it for everybody to know. Why hide it if there's something wrong with it? So the results of sin are devastating. But the ultimate results of sin are much worse. Turn to Revelation chapter 20. Last passage we're going to look at today. Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. Chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was no place found for them. I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which are written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Everyone who was standing before God at this judgment is someone whose name was not written in the book. And notice, these people come from the sea and from Hades and from death itself. They're brought back from the dead to stand in judgment before God, and this is called the second death, the ultimate death. And this ends up with people being eternally separated from God in the lake of fire. This is the ultimate result of sin. The ultimate result is eternal separation from, and it hasn't happened yet. Hasn't happened yet. This is going to happen in the future. But there is this eternal result. And so when we think about sin, a biblical understanding of sin helps us understand a number of key things. It helps us understand that sin wasn't created, wasn't caused by God. It wasn't designed by God. Sin is in opposition to God. It helps us to understand why people are so hurtful to others and even themselves. People make destructive choices every day. Why? Sin. Sin is why. Why can people be so wicked, murderous, adulterous, pride, selfish? Why are people acting that way? Ducks quack, cows moo, pigs oink, and sinners sin. Sinners sin. Why is sin so disruptive and destructive in the Christian life? Because while sin might be an integral and accepted part of the unsaved life, it is totally unacceptable in the Christian life. We can never accept sin as a part of our Christian life. Doesn't mean we won't sin. We just can't accept it as anything other than totally uncalled for and totally unacceptable for us. Sin is real and serious. It results not only in our guilt and shame, but it also hurts others and it kills. All are guilty of sinning. So we all have a sin problem. But it's a problem that we cannot fix. We're not qualified and we're not capable to fix it. Think about it. Sin is a problem we're not qualified or capable of fixing. When we have other problems that we are not qualified or capable of doing, what do? We call for help, don't we? If you wreck the plumbing in your home, you are not qualified or capable of handling that. So what do? Call Danny Proctor. That's what you do. Because he's qualified to fix it and he's capable of fixing it. And so sin is exactly the same way. Sin has wrecked our life. And we're not qualified or capable of fixing it. But thanks be to God, because he has sent someone qualified and capable of fixing the sin problem. You see, in order to be qualified to fix the problem of sin, you have to be a sinless man. Only one sinless man, Jesus Christ. He's qualified. To be capable of fixing the sin problem, he's qualified, but to be capable of fixing the sin problem, you have to be able to pay the penalty, the satisfactory penalty for sin. Only Jesus Christ, the God-man, can do that. Sin is more contagious and deadly than COVID-19. Sin has a 100% infection rate and a 100% mortality rate. And unlike COVID-19, which seems to strike some segments of the population more than others, sin does not discriminate. It strikes everybody the same. And you are no more capable of solving your sin problem than you are solving the COVID problem. But there is one who is qualified, one who is capable, and one who has already done it. Jesus Christ. Let's praise his name. Please stand with me as we close in a word of prayer. Father, we give you thanks